Welcome, everyone. It's so great to have you here with us tonight. And my name is Helen, and myself and Ollie will be hosting the event this evening. Tonight, we're thinking about the question, is Christianity good for women? It's such an important question, and we're so glad that you guys have come along tonight to think about and discuss this topic with us. This is actually our third event this month, all of which have been based around the theme of worth. And we'll have some more events coming up, so do follow our Instagram to find out more about those. Well, just to give you a little bit of an idea of how this evening is going to run, our three panelists will begin by each giving a short talk, and then there'll be a good amount of time for you guys to ask your questions. We really value questions and the people who ask them, so please don't hold back. Ask your questions by commenting either on Facebook or on YouTube, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible, aiming to finish up the event about 8:40. Great. Well, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ollie now, and he can introduce us to our first panelist.
Thanks, Helen. And it's our great pleasure to be joined by Gabby, Ellie, and Abby this evening, each of whom will be approaching this question from a slightly different angle. Our first speaker, Abby, studied history at Oxford University before doing a year as an intern at a Christian music charity. She now works for them part-time whilst completing a part-time MA in early modern history at King's College in London. She's particularly interested in tracing the roots of feminism through history and looking at how the Bible has been used to both oppress and uplift women. So, Abby, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ollie. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight. And so it's not very often in life that you introduce yourself with your worldviews. Most people, I think, like we just did, kind of go for their jobs or what they're studying. But given tonight's event as an investigation of whether Christianity is good news for women, I think it's worth me introducing myself as a Christian and a feminist. These two terms appear to be a contradiction to many people. And that's actually the premise of the title of tonight, isn't it? Christianity has been sexist and patriarchal. So how can you be a Christian who's feminist? And to answer this question, I think we need to investigate another question, which is the title I've given to this brief talk. I think we need to investigate the question, where does misogyny come from? Because we need to have a clear grasp of the problem that faces women in order to identify what will help and what will harm us. So the word misogyny arrived in the English language in about the 17th century, combining two Greek words, miso being hate and gyne being woman. But misogyny didn't appear along with the word itself. No, the words just described a reality that was already there. It's much, much harder to date the first misogynistic act or thought, because the mistreatment of women seems to have existed in some form in every society, in every period that has ever existed. Not just in Christian countries in the West, but in all kinds, types, and forms of society. I have seen no evidence that a society has ever existed without misogyny. So where does it come from? Some hardline feminists have argued that it comes directly from men, but I think that most of us would accept that this isn't accurate or satisfying as an answer. I hope that all the women on this call have known men who have valued them without qualification or limitation on the basis of their sex. I know that I have. And certainly most of the founders of the feminist movement, from Mary Wollstonecraft to Gloria Steinem, have not argued for the wholesale conviction of the evil of men as individual enactors of oppression. No, feminist thinkers have tended instead to describe the systems by which women have become devalued. This we have called patriarchy, which in its simplest form is father rule, meaning in this context, the structures of a society which enable the dehumanization of women in the effort to restrict power to men. So I think that most feminists would answer the question, where does misogyny come from, with patriarchy. And I find this diagnosis pretty persuasive, both in my present existence as a woman in the 21st century and as a historian. I'm convinced that women have been and are oppressed by patriarchal expectations. This is what I mean when I say of myself that I'm feminist. I agree that this patriarchy is a big problem. But the struggle that I have with feminism is that it just doesn't go far enough for me. Because a good doctor doesn't just diagnose you with an illness, she tells you the source of it and how to eradicate that source. So patriarchy is a symptom of the problem. Yes, it causes misogyny. But how can you defeat something as faceless and shifting as patriarchy? How can you eradicate something so historically pervasive? And what's its cause? These are questions to which I have not yet found any satisfying answers in feminism. And it's where I feel that Christianity does a better job. For the Christian answer to the question, where does misogyny come from, I find not just persuasive, but compelling, empowering, and entirely accurate in its description of the state of humanity. The Bible begins with 2 poems describing the creation of the universe. And like all good poetry, it conveys not necessarily exact scientific data, but great truths about meaning and beauty. The poems tell us that in the beginning, God created everything that is. And as part of this creation, he made man and woman. Man and woman were the 2 sides of the coin of humanity, and together they reflected the power, beauty, and diversity of God. The poet writes, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So here, the man and the woman are created and given a joint mandate to steward all creation, to reign together under God in perfect harmony with one another. And it's beautiful. When Adam first sees Eve, he responds with the first love poem ever written. "Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." It's an awesome statement of equality and diversity, of acknowledging that men and women are different and that they are equal. But then, after this moment of bliss, comes an awful chapter which describes how things fell apart. I'm sure we all know bits of the story, even if we've never read it. A serpent who represents evil deceives Adam and Eve, and together they reject God's design for the world. They rebel against him. This is what the Bible means by the word sin. It's to reject God. And when God comes and asks them about what's happened, we see something really tragic. God asks Adam, "Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" The man said, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it." A chapter before, Adam was rejoicing in the fact that Eve was different to him. But now her difference is a cause of tension between them. Her sex difference is used by Adam to explain away his guilt. In effect, he's saying, this woman that you, God, put here, this other, it's her fault. He's actually blaming God for the situation, but he's distancing himself from Eve on the basis of sex. And I think there's implicit judgment here. A few moments ago, her different was something glorious. Now it's distasteful and negative. My aim here is not to paint Adam as the embodiment of misogyny and sexism. No, when Eve faces the same question, she blames the serpent, as though she had no agency in the situation, when we know that she had been given the same mission as Adam. My aim instead is to show where misogyny comes from, because it comes in the Christian worldview from a deeper problem, a fundamental brokenness in humanity, which is echoed from Adam and Eve through every iteration of man and woman. Because if God designed the world, then when humanity, as represented by Adam and Eve, rejected his design, they ruptured the fabric of every kind of relationship. Firstly, our relationship with God, then our relationship with each other, between men and women, as well as our relationship with creation and our relationship with ourselves. Patriarchy is a symptom of this fundamental brokenness. It's not the whole picture. The whole picture encompasses all of the evil and suffering of humanity, a humanity which has since never managed to liberate women from misogyny, and a cause which is rooted in the heart of every single one of us, man and woman, that we reject God and his design. Misogyny flows out from the fact that we have removed God from his throne and destroyed his design for all relationships. In other words, misogyny comes from sin. And the rest of the Bible shows us that sin leads to a kind of living death. It causes sexism, racism, classism, addiction. It blinds us to the needs of others. It's selfish and it's cruel and it's harsh. And it's not just a living death that it leads to, it actually also leads to real death and judgment on us for rejecting God. And this is why I think Christianity is not just good news for women, but the best possible news. And not just for women, but for all of humanity. Because whilst the Bible does have words on sin and judgment, the main story of the Bible is not one of humanity, but of God. Of this God who made man and woman in his image, but did not abandon us when we rejected him. Instead, he came down in the person of Jesus Christ in order to defeat sin, including misogyny. And at the end of Jesus' life, he stood in a garden, just like Adam and Eve had stood in a garden. And instead of passing the blame for something he had done to someone else, there he shouldered the blame for everything he had not done. And he walked from the garden to a cross where he died as a sacrifice in our place, bearing the punishment we deserve. And then he rose from the dead to prove his victory. And this is great news for women, because it means that God has made a way for us to have relationship with him. And it's great news for women because Jesus promises that he's coming back to judge all the evil of the world. One day, all misogyny will be seen and judged. And for those women and men who have trusted in Jesus, that will be a day of great rejoicing. It will be the day when misogyny finally dies. This is why I say that I'm a feminist and a Christian, because only Jesus Christ has promised a complete cure for the evil of misogyny. Thanks very much for listening. I think I'll hand back over to our hosts.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Abby. And just to say, guys, keep sending in your questions, whether you're watching on Facebook or whether you're watching on YouTube. You can write your questions in the comments and they'll come up for us as well. So that's great. Keep sending those in. Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our second speaker this evening, who is Gabby Samuel. Gabby is currently living in London and working for Stockwell Baptist Church and the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches. This evening, Gabby will be looking at the relationships that Jesus had with women throughout the Gospels and how the life of Jesus shapes our conceptions of power and oppression. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Gabby. I'll hand over to you now.
It's fantastic to be here with you guys. Abby, I needed that. Thank you so much, Abby. But I'm going to be answering the same question this evening. Is Christianity bad for women? You don't have to be a woman thinking about Christianity for very long before this question will cross your mind. Telling friends or family that you're thinking about Christianity or you're exploring Christianity can feel like you're almost letting the side down. You're undermining years of our foremothers' fights for freedom and equality. Secretly, you love the patriarchy, and you're taking a vow maybe to stop using your brain, certainly to stop using your voice. But these are not only questions asked of us as women, but they're often questions we ask ourselves. Do women have to opt into subjugation, become content with a second-class status, experiencing a quieting of vibrancy or confidence to confess that the gospel is true and that Jesus Christ is Lord? Well, some of these concerns, as we all well know, they're not without basis, and we will come to that soon. But first, we must consider a biblical ethic of women and the biblical ethic of the treatment of women. But thankfully, Christian ethics are not agreed upon by a think tank somewhere. They're not recommendations at the end of a report. No. Christianity, Christian ethics, Christian behavior are predicated upon a person. They're not abstract philosophical claims made by who happens to be in power, which is obviously often men, not at all. But they are conformity to the image of a person. And that is the person of Jesus Christ. And so to consider the relationship between Christianity and women, we first must consider the relationship between Jesus Christ and women. And so let me set the scene for you. The historic context in which Jesus places himself into is Israel in the 1st century. It's okay if you're not very familiar, why would you be? But in Israel in the 1st century, women are not just implicitly and quietly considered to be of lesser value. They are explicitly and loudly considered to be so. The testimonies of women are not admissible in court. Just think about what that means for crimes committed against women. Women are rarely educated. They have little to no interaction with men outside of the home. They have little life outside of the home. A common prayer prayed by men at the time was to thank God for all his goodness in not making them Gentiles, dogs, or women. And it is in this context we read of Jesus Christ doing things like the following. We see him praising a woman called Mary, the sister of a woman called Martha, who chose to sit at his feet next to men in a public place as a student, as a disciple. And rather than chastise her for not helping in the kitchen, not helping her sister serve him, far from that, he affirms her. He tells people to leave her alone because she has chosen the better thing, sitting at his feet, coming to know who he is. Into this 1st century context, we find Jesus speaking alone with a woman. Not very radical for us today, but it certainly would have been shockingly radical for women and men at the time. But not just is he alone with any woman, no. He's alone with a woman who has had 5 husbands. Now, even in our context, we may raise an eyebrow or two. But in the context at the time, this would have been absolutely wild. She would have been known and had a reputation of being promiscuous. So Jesus is alone with a woman known to be promiscuous, but it doesn't stop there. She's a Samaritan. She's half Jewish and half Gentile. She would have been seen as a walking memorial to the dilution of the pure Jewish bloodline, a walking reminder of Jewish unfaithfulness to God that they would much rather forget, and I'm sure they would have treated her accordingly. He chose to be alone with a woman considered to be promiscuous and at the bottom of the social and ethnic pecking order. What will Jesus do? Will he take advantage of her like most other men have? No one will believe her anyway. Will he belittle her, embarrass her? Will he shame her? Far from it. He doesn't patronize her. He calls her out for a sin. She's an adult, she can take it. He doesn't patronize her. He doesn't ignore her, but he has a personal and intimate conversation with this woman. He gives her the due dignity she has. He humanizes her. He sees her. He engages with her. He lets others see him engaging with her, and he isn't ashamed about it. We could go on and on about Jesus' interactions with women. The fact that human history was orchestrated such that the last people with Jesus as he died, and the first people to bear witness to his resurrection were women. These interactions of Jesus with women must be central to the Christianity that we're weighing in the balance as good or bad for women. But no interaction should mean more in answering this question than this specific interaction. Jesus Christ on a cross, dying for women. The life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ was for and remains for women. He's hung upon a cross knowing the names of every single woman he would save. He knows their names. It is for us that Jesus Christ died. Christ, who is the eternal, all good, all holy, all compassionate Son of God, he takes on a human body and he lays that body down for women. Christianity is good for women because Christianity tells us of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that gospel is good news for women. Is Christianity bad for women? No. It is good news for women. It is good for women. But have Christians been bad for women? Well, the answer here has to be yes. Christianity, no doubt about it, has been weaponized by many and used to suit the wicked, self-seeking, and perverted desires of the human heart. Men have held disproportionate amounts of power across all sectors and spheres of life throughout history, and we have innumerable examples of that power being abused, and probably have innumerable more examples of power being abused that will never see the light of day. Some even using Christianity as their justification. There's a lot to say about why that is the case. Abby has covered that excellently, speaking before me. But here I do want to flag one more reason why Christianity is good news for women, and that is because of a Christian conception of power. So it's not just the ethic of engaging with women that Jesus Christ gives us, but it's how Jesus Christ uses power, which he more than anybody certainly does have, not just by virtue of being a male, but by virtue of being God. And so bear with me, I'm going to go on a little journey. Whilst it may stick in our throats a little bit, generally speaking, men tend to be physically stronger than women. Generally speaking, most men will be stronger than most women. And my thinking is that over time, that physical power was converted into a dominance in the workplace, because obviously most jobs were manual, you were building things, knocking things down, carrying things. So that physical power converts into work, the ability to work. And that converts into financial power, because obviously when you work, you get paid money. And then financial power inevitably will convert into systematic power. And therefore, we arrive at this point in history where men do have structural power. Although it is being chipped away at here and there, it is established and it is undeniable. So a helpful question is, now that we are here, misogyny is here, power asymmetries are here. Now that we're here, how does Christianity conceive of power? The funny thing is, the Bible actually has a lot to say about this. Within a Christian framework, there is a function to power. And the function of power is not to assert dominance over the other. It's not to be used to self-interest. It's not to be used to dominate, to shut others out or to shut others up. Asymmetries in power are to be used to the betterment of the one who is less powerful. It is to be used to uplift, to serve, to empower. Godly power gives itself away in the service of others. We see this no more clearly than in the person of Jesus Christ. He is God, all powerful, the one who created and sustains absolutely anything. And he comes to earth and he takes on a body and he accrues wealth, dominates and violates women, and uses his power to subjugate everybody. No, for the record, that's not what happens. who uses his power for the sake of the other. Far from self-interest, we see self-sacrifice. Far from domineering others, we see him uplifting others. He serves others. He encourages others. He serves women. This is helpful for us as people thinking about Christianity because it gives us a framework within which to conceive of power and its right use, and therefore to hold its wrong use to account. Generally speaking, but specifically within the church and specifically within church leadership. Happy to take more questions on this, but here I'll summarize. Jesus, and therefore Christianity, is good news for women because we have a saviour who loves women, who dies for women, and who uses his power to serve and empower women. And back to our host.
Gabby, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Before I hand over to our final speaker, let me take this chance to remind you that we're going to be putting your questions to Abby, Gabby, and Ellie at the end of this evening and giving them the opportunity to respond. If you have a question, we want to hear it. So here's our commitment. Any honest question gets an honest answer. Leave your question in the comments, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. Comment below this video, and we'll work through as many of those questions as we can. Our final speaker this evening is Ellie Cook. Ellie lives in London, where she works with students at All Souls Langham Place, along with me. She studied theology at St Andrews and Durham universities, and her MA focus was on violence against women in the Old Testament. Let me flag up at this point that in Ellie's talk, she's going to be talking about rape and violence against women. So if you're not comfortable this evening thinking about that for whatever reason, we absolutely understand. Please do take a break from this broadcast for the next 10 minutes or so while Ellie is sharing. But for now, Ellie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much, Abby and Gabby, for what you've shared. In the summer of 2017, I spent 3 months writing a 15,000 word master's dissertation about rape. It wasn't the most fun way to spend my time, but it was, I think, important. My MA was in theology, and so the particular rape that I was writing about was from an account in the Bible of a young woman called Tamar, who was raped by her half-brother. Both at the time and still today, when people ask what I wrote on, they're usually pretty surprised by the answer. The questions sometimes vocalized, sometimes not, are why would you do that? And also, why is a story like that in the Bible? That second question is one that comes up a lot, including among the academics I was engaging with as I did my research. There's a lot of suspicion and concern about this story and others that are similar, and I suppose the morality of their presence in the Bible. Much like our question for this evening, people ask, is the Bible good for women if it's full of stories like this one? Christians claim that the Bible is God's word. We believe that he speaks to us through it, but what kind of God would speak through a text that tells stories like that of Tamar raped by her brother, or Dinah raped by a stranger, or Bathsheba raped by the king, or the story of one nameless woman handed over to be gang raped and murdered? What kind of a God would tell those stories, and why should we read them? Now, I could talk about this subject for a really long time, but we haven't got time this evening. So instead, I want to just say 4 small things that I think will begin to give an answer. Firstly, we're told these stories because they're true. They were true then, and they're true today. In England and Wales every year, around 85,000 women experience rape or serious sexual assault, and over 1.5 million women a year experience domestic violence. As of a week ago, 95 women in the UK had been murdered by men since the beginning of 2020. That's around 1 woman every 3 days. I came across the following quote recently: "Not all men practice violence against women, but all women live with the threat of male violence every single day, all over the earth." Now, it's a pretty bleak statement, and for many of us, it's a very personal one. As we, or women we know and love, have experienced varying degrees of violence at the hands of men. When the Me Too movement went viral a few years ago, there was a weird degree of suspicion being expressed by people online and in the press, and even just in kind of everyday interactions. There were questions about what was going on. Why were people suddenly talking about this? Could it really be this big or this bad? Were women just jumping on a bandwagon or complicit in some giant conspiracy to overthrow powerful men? Or was there just a sudden epidemic of rape and abuse and harassment? The reality, of course, was that the terrible treatment of women wasn't new. It's just that now it was being spoken about on a new scale. The Bible accounts that I've referred to help to demonstrate that. Tamar was raped by her brother nearly 3,000 years ago. This isn't a 21st century issue, and it isn't a small thing. If we're going to talk about what's good, and by implication what's bad for women, then we've got to acknowledge the horror and the prevalence of the violence that so many of us will experience. What kind of a God would just ignore the brutal reality of what it means to be a woman in this world? Now, the second thing that the Bible does is to acknowledge the horror of these stories and of the experience of so many women. And it gives us a reason to call those things evil. Now, I've recently been reading a little book by Germaine Greer, simply titled On Rape. And I was interested in one argument that she began to explore in the book, although I don't think she ever went much beyond kind of beginning to pose the questions. Her major question was this: how much damage does rape actually do? Now, the implications that she was making were that women were told that even kind of non-violent rape or sexual abuse would have a serious psychological effect. And so because they were told that, it did have that effect, but that perhaps the reaction was merely societally imposed. In a culture that says that sex doesn't have to be emotional or imbued with any special meaning, how are we supposed to think about rape? In a society where we're often nervous about objective truth or definitive ideas about evil and good, how do we make sense of how we instinctively, viscerally respond to stories of rape and abuse and violence? When reading the Bible accounts that I mentioned, there's no space to just shrug our shoulders or to treat them with ambivalence. The language is brutal. The consequences are violent. There's no moral ambiguity in these stories. Sex in the ethic presented in the Bible is not supposed to be casual or unemotional. It's never intended to be a mere physical act. And so, of course, the emotional, psychological, spiritual, and physical effects of rape are huge. But also, the Bible is clear that there's such a thing as objective truth, and that to treat a human being as nothing but an object for our own sexual gratification, or as a means of abusing our power and dominance, is objectively evil. Now, the Bible claims some huge things about God, which I believe are true, and I don't have the time to kind of take you through all the evidence for why these claims are trustworthy, but I do want to give you some reasons why I think they're worth examining. And so that's where we're going to be for points 3 and 4. So number 3, as well as calling these acts of violence and abuse evil, the Bible promises justice. 5% of reported rapes in England and Wales end in a conviction. 5. That doesn't feel much like justice, does it? And when it comes to stories of rape and abuse and violence against women, many of us feel pretty angry, but also pretty helpless. Whether we've experienced it firsthand or we've seen a loved one go through it, many of us will know that the idea of justice for victims is rare and usually unsatisfying. And yet, the Bible claims that God is a good and perfect judge who will bring justice. He won't miss evidence. He won't be overworked. He won't be corrupted or tricked into believing lies. He knows everything and sees everything, and he cares for those who are overlooked, beaten down, and mistreated. We might struggle sometimes with the concept of God judging us, but when we're in need of some justice, then the fact that he is a judge is really good news. Fourthly, the Bible promises that everything is going to be made right in the end. Sometimes the stories and the statistics are too much. There's so much violence and cruelty and grief and injustice bound up in this world, and there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. And yet the Christian story promises hope and life and goodness. At this time of year, as we get ready to celebrate Christmas, Christians talk a lot about light in the darkness. The Bible teaches us that at the first Christmas, God stepped into the darkness and injustice of this world in the person of Jesus. Jesus came as a light in the darkness. As Gabby's already shown us, his treatment of women was unquestionably kind and right, never treating women as objects for his gratification, never abusing his power, and never turning a blind eye to injustice. But most significantly, his death on the cross and his coming back from the dead mean that he offers something so much more than merely a good example of what a man should be. Instead, he offers us the certainty of life beyond what we know now, of an end to the sadness and grief and fear that seems to be stamped into this world, and the hope and promise of a renewed world where violence and abuse are no more, where we'll live in peace, and where every tear and grief will be wiped away. And thanks so much, and I'm going to hand back to the hosts now.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Ellie. And thank you to Abby and Gabby also. That was really helpful. And also thank you to you guys and for all of you who have sent in your questions. Please do continue to do that. We've got our Q&A coming up now. And like I said before, we'll try and answer as many of those questions as we can. Our first question in our Q&A is going to be asked to Abby. I'll wait for you to come on screen. Hey, Abby.
Hiya.
So the question is, does not the very concept of women being taken from man not create a hierarchy at the same time as making the Genesis story obviously mythological?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's got two parts to it. So there's the kind of mythology angle, and then there's the, is this an implicit hierarchy? On the mythology question, I think, like I mentioned in my talk, it's important to remember that the opening chapters of Genesis are set up to answer questions of meaning and the principal actors in the universe, God and humanity. It's not necessarily set up to convey exact scientific data. And I think it would probably be for a different topic on a different night to go into that. So if we take the Genesis account of creation as being primarily interested in setting up the way that the world works, then we do have to answer this question of, is this a hierarchy that we're looking at here in the way that woman is created out of man? And this is a debate that has happened many times in the public arena. I actually wrote my thesis on a pamphlet on this very question, which was published in the 1610s, where one guy wrote a pamphlet which was all about how awful and innately evil women were. And one of the evidences that he used for this was that women were taken out the side of man, so they're like, you know, a kind of nasty spare part, basically like the spare tire that you keep in your boot and you hope you never have to deal with. But a woman, Rachel Spate, who wrote back to him, said, no, you've got the whole thing upside down, the side, not the head and not the foot. Woman was equal. She's not taken from his head to be authoritative over man, and she's not taken from his foot to be lesser. She is taken from his side. So I actually think the choice of a rib or from the side is really key. It shows that woman is intimately connected to man. There's something that is innately similar about them. They're both human, but different in a way that is entirely equal. So I hope that's a bit of an answer to that question. Would love to go into the science stuff, but I'm really not the right person, so I'll leave that to another night.
Thanks so much, Abby. Our next question I'm going to throw out to Gabby if she's there. And the question is, let me just find it. What is / should be women's role in church? Isn't church decreasing the value of women by restricting them from certain areas like leadership, etc.? And actually, I think another one came in similarly. You might want to touch on that as well, which was, how does Jesus's view of women inform women in leadership and women preaching in the modern church?
Yes, fantastic question. And Christians who love the Lord and who are trusting in Jesus to save them and who are secure in that disagree on what it looks like for women to be in the life of the church, where that goes, what that looks like. And so I'll share two views, and then I'll say what my thoughts are, and then maybe there'll be more questions, we'll see. But yeah, some women, some churches would hold to the point of view that men and women, there's no distinction between what they are and are not able to do in the life of the church. And so that's at every level of church leadership. Other churches would hold to the idea that men are given a responsibility specifically in the home and in the church to lead the church. What that looks like in their church family will vary across churches who hold to that view. So for some, that will mean only men preaching. For some, that will mean women preaching, but with male leadership. It will look different in church families. I think it is important to stress our unity on this. All Christians everywhere believe that women are of equal value and worth, equally worthy of dignity, equally worthy of salvation. Hopefully you saw that in my talk. Different churches will think differently about how that plays out in the life of the church. So I'm in a church, and my own convictions are what would be called complementarity, that men and women are different, and that is a good thing. We are different. We're not interchangeable. We are different, and that difference will look different in the life of the church and the life of the home, and that ultimately God has given responsibility to men to lead the church. Now, what that does not mean is that women are less able. Women are less intelligent, women are less capable, women are less gifted even. So then why is that in place? Why would I, as a woman living in London, why would I believe that? Because I think actually the relationship between men and women, specifically in marriage and specifically in the church, but specifically in marriage, is actually pointing forward to something else. They don't exist in and of themselves for the sake of themselves. The relationship between men and women in marriage, and to some degree in the church, but specifically in marriage, is to point forward to a bigger marriage, actually, a wider, more glorious, more eternal, more beautiful, more significant relationship. And that relationship between Christ and his church, Christ and his bride. And so because of the responsibility and the service that Christ does for his church, for his bride, that is mirrored in marriage, and therefore is mirrored to some degree in the church. The last thing I'd say on this is, again, hopefully something that I touched on slightly in my talk. What does leadership look like for the Christian? What does leadership look like in the church? What ought it to look like in the church? What ought it to look like in the home? Leadership, power, exercise of authority for the Christian is fundamentally service, fundamentally. So to say that you want to lead is equivalent to saying that you want to serve. To saying that you want to lead the church is saying that you want to serve the church. It is not something that is used to silence, to push down, but something that is used to uplift. So actually where men are using those roles that they're given well, the women that are around them should feel uplifted, should be uplifted in the life of the church. That's what it should look like. In summary, Christians disagree and can joyfully and beautifully disagree. But even where it may look a bit more archaic, that is supposed to be a glorious and freeing and uplifting thing for women. Come back to me with any other questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Gabby. Our next question is for Ellie. Hey, great. Hi. So the question is, to what degree can Christianity contribute to a feminist liberation struggle, as long as it categorizes all sexuality beyond hetero marriage as sinful and gender within a binary opposition of male and female?
Great. Thanks, Sam. What an easy question. Okay, so I guess I'm going to have a go at this, but it may not be satisfactory. Sorry if that's the case. But I guess probably there's two questions there, aren't there, really? And I suppose in one question, we're talking about like, heterosexuality and kind of what that how we understand that, and whether that is sort of a kind of a sort of exclusive heterosexuality is sort of compatible with feminism. And then the other question, I suppose, is to do with gender and binary gender and non-binary, and whether that's compatible with feminism. And the reason I want to answer those as kind of separately is because particularly the second part, to do with gender, be a huge disagreement amongst feminists, both Christian feminists but also secular feminists, about what a kind of legitimate feminist position on this is. And I think particularly in the last sort of couple of years, there's been almost a kind of war going on within feminism. And I suppose the idea that for some feminists, they would say kind of conversations around gender, transgender, binary, non-binary are actually undermining feminism and kind of denying something really important about it, what it means to be a woman. Obviously, that is a really controversial conversation. That's the sort of thing that gets you cancelled if you say the wrong thing. And so I'm sort of a little bit just wary of that. I guess then on the other kind of issue, this question of like, what about sexuality? And does kind of a sort of the narrowness of Christian views on sexuality say that sort of undermine feminist ideals? I guess partly it's going to come down to what do we think about sexuality and sex and a kind of sexual ethic. And I spoke a little bit about that in my talk, obviously kind of thinking in terms of really different issues. But the kind of the big picture of the Bible is saying a couple of things about sex. One, it's saying it is good, that it's a it's not just a kind of utilitarian thing like to have children. It's supposed to be an enjoyable thing, but also that it's not supposed to be that it's not just about our gratification, our enjoyment. That there is more to it than that. There's supposed to be more than just there's supposed to be emotion, and there's supposed to be love, and there's supposed to be all sorts of things going on within that, and that it's supposed to be more than just about the couple as well. It says something in terms of what the Bible says about sexuality, is saying that actually it's primarily about pointing to something about who God is and what he's like. And so Abby kind of touched on this a little bit in her talk, the idea that male and female are made in the image of God. They're made for one another. And there's something really valuable about that. The idea that men and women, a man and a woman together, they as a couple image God. One on their own doesn't do it, but two together do. And that marriage, in terms of the Bible story, is not just about me, falling in love with somebody and wanting to have a life with them, although it is about that, but it's about pointing towards who God is and the way that he relates to his people. And I guess also just there's this kind of question of what do we think about who God is and who he says he is? Because my contention is that God is the creator. He's made us, he's designed us, he's created this world for us to live in. And because of that, I believe that he knows what's best for us. If you don't believe those things about God, then obviously the idea that somebody says, God says this is what you should believe about sex, this is what you should believe about who you have sex with, seems unreasonable. And so there is like a big tension there, isn't there? That my kind of belief about God and the fact that he's got an opinion about what I do with my body really conflicts. If you don't believe the same thing about God, if you don't believe he exists, then obviously you're gonna sort of struggle to buy my kind of arguments. But I think ultimately what we get in the Bible is we get this picture of God creating people to know him and love him. He's made them in a particular way. He's designed them to be at their best when they live the way that he wants them to. And there's something really beautiful about living in that way. And there's also something really beautiful about living the way that God has made you. And I guess some of the times, particularly with the kind of binary stuff, the frustration, I suppose, is our culture's perceptions of what makes a man, what makes a woman, what makes masculine, what makes feminine, is sometimes real mixed up. And so as we kind of consider our own, what do I think is masculine, what do I think is feminine, if I don't feel right in one of those things, is that actually because our culture has said something really negative about what those things are? And instead, do we want to, rather than kind of having the culture speak into it, and rather having our own sort of opinion speak into it, which I guess we know can sometimes be messed up, we could get things wrong, do we rather want to listen to somebody who says that he created us and created this world to live in? If he is who he says he is, then it stands to reason that he knows what he's talking about when it comes to every aspect of our lives, including sexuality. If he's not who he says he is, if he's a figment of my imagination, then obviously feel free to ignore everything I've just said and do what you want to do. But if he is true, then worth considering what he says about what is best for you and the best way to live. Hopefully that gave some answer. But
thanks, Ellie. This is a big question, so I'm just going to bring in Gabby as well. Gabby, do you have anything you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, this is a question that I think I have a particular amount of personal buy-in on. Being a single woman, they're not abstract questions, they're personal. And I think there are two truths that have really been helpful for me in thinking about how do I think about Christianity and gender and sex and kind of a Christian ethic of marriage and sex within marriage and those sorts of things. Two truths that I think are really interesting. First of all, who was Jesus? Jesus was a single man. Jesus was never married. And therefore, if we hold that he kept the law, Jesus never had sex. Interesting to think about Jesus' sexuality. Jesus is the person to whom Christians consider to be the person who fully experienced all of what it means to be human, who fully experienced all of what it means to live the fullness of human life on this earth. He's the person who most knows what it is to be fully loved, fully known, to be fully compassionate, to have fully intimate relationships. The person who was most able to not fear rejection and therefore love well. Jesus is our example of what it means to live a fully human, fully fleshed, fully orbed, holistic life. And he does so as a single man. Now, that is a direct challenge to how we conceive of sexuality. Sexuality is important. It is something created, that we are created with. But sometimes the weight that I've given it, the weight that sometimes our culture and context can give it, doesn't quite fit with who Jesus is and what he says of himself and his fullness of humanity. And so there is a sense in which if you do not live out that fully fledged idea of marriage, 4 kids /3 kids /1 kid if you live in London, can't afford anything else. If you don't achieve that goal, there's something of life that you have been limited from, excluded from, your relationships are never quite as deep, etc., etc. Jesus Christ is a direct confrontation to that point of view, and is something well worth considering, the nature of Jesus' sexuality. Secondly, this was really wisely spoken about. Maybe I'm going to speak about it a bit less wisely. Just the nature of sex. I think sex is a more helpful biological category because gender is so socially constructed. It carries so much weight in different contexts and cultures. And this is one thing that I love about Christianity. Christianity is flexible enough to make its home in any cultural context. There's very little explicit prescription about what it means to be feminine or masculine in the Bible. We do have a generic picture of godliness. We know what godliness looks like, but very rarely, in terms of percentage, is that fleshed out in a particularly masculine or feminine way. Christians are often spoken to together. Christians are like this, Christians are like this, Christians are like this. Very rarely, men ought to be this, women ought to be this. Now, it's there sometimes, but it's quite rare, which means that the cultural conceptions of femininity across history and across geography, Christianity can make its home there. Conceptions of femininity and masculinity that are unique to Western British culture in 2020 don't have to translate to Ghanaian culture if the gospel goes there. And Ghanaian understandings of femininity and masculinity don't have to be translated to Egyptian culture when the gospel goes there. There's space within Christianity for it to make its home within a cultural context, and therefore allowing cultures to maintain something of their uniqueness, something of their individuality. Now, obviously, where those conceptions of masculinity and femininity are unhelpful and ungodly, they need to be challenged. But different cultures have conceived of these things differently, and Christianity gives space for that and doesn't need to call those things sinful or unhelpful, which means that a cultural reflection of masculinity and femininity, to the degree to which the person wants to adhere to those things, there's space for that within Christianity. Hope that makes sense.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks to both you and Ellie, and also Sam for asking the question. That's really helpful. The next question we're asking is to Abby.
Hiya.
Hey. Abby, the question that has been asked is, does the creation order suggest that patriarchy was in fact God's original design, but it has been corrupted, warped, and sullied by sin?
Cool, thanks. This is a really good question, and one that I think, kind of like what Gabby was saying about roles for men and women within Christianity, I think Christians will come down on different points on this question. I think it may be true that if we take father rule or patriarchy, if you want to define it in that base level and remove the misogyny and the struggle that has existed around it, it's true that you can read that from the creation order. But I think that we need to remember that we don't have a lengthy picture of what it looked like for Adam and Eve before the fall. The writer of Genesis didn't decide to tell us, and so Adam got up and went out and sowed the fields and Eve made the dinner. That's not a picture that we're given. And I think this comes back to what I think Gabby was just saying about there actually being an enormous amount of flex in the Christian picture of man and woman. But if we say that that there is a concept of patriarchy, but it's one that we cannot understand, I think into that context, we also need to remember what Gabby was also saying in her earlier talk about just how radical Jesus was when he lived, and how he was particularly radical with regards to power. There's a very famous bit in one of the Gospels just before Jesus dies, in fact, the night before he dies, where he washes his disciples' feet, which is the position that a servant would take, the lowest servant in the household. And he says, in effect, if you want to be a leader, this is what you do. So if patriarchy is God's intention, and I'm not saying necessarily that it is, like I said, Christians will disagree, but if patriarchy was God's intention, then it's a kind of patriarchy in which men are getting on their hands and knees and washing the feet, metaphorically, of women. It's one where authority means to lay down your life in order to love and serve those around you. And so if that is the case, that is a picture so far away from the patriarchy that we exist in that it's almost incomparable. It's a gap that's so vast we can't see to the other side. So I'm kind of sidestepping your question, but I hope that goes some way to kind of sharing some thoughts on it.
Thanks so much, Abby. Our next question I'm going to put to Ellie, and it's this one. Why would God let violence against women happen if he's able to stop it? Why not intervene?
Yeah, great question. And one that's like personally really hard for me to get my head around. It is, and I guess particularly having done the work that I've done on this area, having had my own experiences, this is like a painful reality of life, and that is really painful. But I guess at heart, this is a question about suffering. Like, why does suffering exist? Why doesn't God intervene? Is he good if he allows it to happen? Those sorts of things. And that is a big question, which I'm not going to be able to give a brilliant answer to in the time that we've got, but I will give as much of an answer as I can. Partly it comes down to the fact that God has made us as people with agency and with choice. And when we are given choices and we're given freedom and we're given power, we don't use it well. And I guess we know that from little ways of our own lives, in terms of the decisions that we make, which we regret, the things that we do that we wish we hadn't done, things that we know we should have done but which we didn't do, all of that kind of those little decisions that we make, things we think about people, those sorts of things. But actually then when we look at an issue like sexual violence, we look at the kind of topic that I was speaking on, we see that in kind of a bigger way. We see that sort of historically, systematically, the people have mistreated those who are weaker than them, more vulnerable than them, those who have power have used it badly. And we see that in the Bible stories, but we see it in our lives and in the world around us when we watch the news, etc. And so that is just the reality of living in this world. And the reason for that is, and has been kind of touched on, particularly in Abby's talk at the beginning, is this sort of Christian concept and religious concept of sin. The idea that we, I suppose, break the rules, but more than that, that we kind of actively go against who God is, what he wants for us, his design for us, his plans for us, his hopes for us, and we turn in ourselves and we basically make decisions that are selfish. We make decisions that are about our gratification, our happiness, and that was kind of at the heart of a lot of this stuff about violence against women. It's about people making selfish decisions for their own satisfaction, their own gratification, their own ease, and so it does come down to kind of people's actions, and then the question is, well, why doesn't God do something about it? Well, there's kind of two things going on there. One is he has, and the second one is that he will. And I'm kind of gonna go to the end first, which is that he is going to, and I kind of talked a little bit about this idea of justice, that God is going to bring justice one day, and we long for that. I long for that. I long for those who have hurt me, those who have damaged me, to face justice. But the problem with that is that as much as I want them to face justice, I don't want to face it myself, because I know that I've also hurt people, that I've also damaged people, that I have gone my own way, done my own thing. And so we've got this kind of wrestle of, I want God to come and bring justice, but I don't want him to bring justice if that means I've got to face it. And so the fact that God doesn't intervene is weirdly for our benefit, because if he does come and intervene, then we have to face it too. And that's why Jesus comes, and that's the kind of answer in terms of that God has done something about it. God sent Jesus to take our place, to take the punishment, to stand in the place that we should stand in, and to be judged in our place. He didn't deserve it. He never did anything wrong. And we have, and he stands in our place and he takes it for us in order that we can be kind of bound up in him, that we can be made right, that we can be forgiven, that we can be set free. And so that when God comes in the end, justice can be done completely. And that is a tricky concept to get our head around, and it's a big thing, which is why I've very briefly rushed over it. But if you want to kind of explore it a bit more, like obviously do talk to people who have invited you, or so on, they kind of probably explain it a bit better. The thing I want to just say about this issue of suffering is that the great thing about knowing Jesus in the midst of that is he's somebody who really does know what it's like to suffer. He knows what it is like to experience pain and suffering and violence and abuse himself. So when we go through things like that, we're not speaking to a God who's sort of aloof and who stands at a distance. We're speaking to a God who's stepped into our existence, who's gone through that pain himself, and so absolutely knows what it feels like, is able to kind of put an arm around us and say, I do understand your pain. And we have in him somebody who's done something about it. Like I said, he's come and he has paid the price. He's begun the beginning of this justice that is going to ultimately end and make everything right again. And the picture that we get of heaven is a place where there isn't any more violence, there isn't any more pain, and that Jesus, the one who knows what it's like to experience suffering, and did actually experience suffering in our place, comes and puts his arm around us and wipes away our tears and brings real healing and real hope. And so it doesn't take away the grief now, but it does promise that it will be taken away in the end. Hopefully that was a helpful enough answer. Ollie.
Thanks so much, Ellie. And thank you to all of our panelists who've just been answering those questions, as well as to you who have asked them. We have just tipped over the 60-minute mark, so I'm going to wrap up our evening together. Is Christianity good for women? We've approached that question from multiple different angles this evening and had a healthy time of Q&A, but I hope that isn't the end of the conversation. You can find out more on the PFE Facebook page that you may well be watching this video on. Or if you're watching this with someone, or you know someone else who's been watching this video, why not flick the kettle on and chat through some of your reflections? Here's a question to start you off. What's been your experience of the relationship between Christianity and women? For now, though, thank you to Abby, to Gabby, and to Ellie. Thank you to all those who asked questions. We really appreciate the honesty and for taking this topic seriously this evening, seriously enough to ask serious questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great evening.